Today's reading is from the 9th chapter of the Gospel of Luke, verses 28 through 43. Now about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter and John and James, and went up on the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly they saw 2 men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but since they had stayed awake, they saw his glory and the 2 men who stood with him. Just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not knowing what he said. While he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my Son, my chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone. And they kept silent, and in those days told no one any of the things that they had seen. The word of the Lord. Today is one of those Sundays when all 3 of the lectionary readings fit together really well. Because I got to read only one of them, I'll summarize the other 2 for you. In the Old Testament reading, Moses has just spent 40 days and 40 nights on Mount Sinai, while God wrote the covenant on 2 tablets of stone. After all of that time in God's presence, Moses' face shone with the reflection of God's glory. The brightness of his face scared everyone, so he put a veil over his face. In the second reading, St. Paul interprets that veil as hiding the fact that Moses' glory will fade at some point. Only through Christ, Paul said, is God's glory accessible for all time, and the veil is no longer necessary. In the passage that I read to you, Peter and John and James saw the glory of Jesus firsthand. Each evangelist describes the transfiguration in a slightly different way. In Luke's version, Jesus is at prayer when he literally becomes other, and his clothing flashes about like lightning. Moses and Elijah also appear in glory, speaking of Jesus' departure. The word for departure is literally exodus. Moses and Elijah are talking about the exodus of Jesus. What does it mean for Jesus to have an exodus? The first exodus, of course, was a defining event for Israel, turning them from slaves into conquerors. God led them from bondage in Egypt to the freedom of the promised land. The exodus of Jesus will be the defining moment for all who believe in him, leading them from the bondage of sin to the freedom of grace and forgiveness. In a paradoxical show of God's glory, Jesus will die on a cross. Yet through his resurrection, he will be confirmed as the Son of God. His final words to his disciples will be, "Lo, I am with you always to the end of the age." The glory of Jesus will never fade. Today is the last Sunday after Epiphany. Lent arrives in a few days on Ash Wednesday. Each year, the Transfiguration shows up on this Sunday, the last Sunday after Epiphany, helping us to prepare for Lent. Today in particular, it shows us the great arc of our faith. God is with us and will lead us out of bondage into freedom. During Lent's 40 days, we'll have the opportunity to reflect on where we are still in bondage to sin, allowing the glory of God to fade. We will take our own exodus through the wilderness to the darkness of the cross before we see the dazzling white glory of the empty tomb. As this long Epiphany season ends, think about how you can prepare yourself for the holy journey of Lent that is before you. Amen.